Hi, it's Ashleigh from Sweet Dreams Bake Shop, and welcome back to my channel where I make a lot of cake and cookie decorating tutorials as well as give a lot of baking business tips. And welcome to the very first time that I am making macarons in my new kitchen. And as I go through this process, I'm going to go over all of the mistakes that you've probably made while making macarons. If you have failed time and time again, or more realistically, maybe you got one really okay batch, but nothing that was perfect, then this is the video for you. The first thing that you're going to need, of course, is a reliable macaron recipe, and I have linked one of my favorites down in the description box below. And let me tell you something. Generally speaking, it's not the recipe's fault if your macarons are failing. It's usually user error. Sorry to break it to you, but just what I've found over the years. My macaron teaching skills were really put to the test the other day. My friend had 4 failed batches of macarons, and I helped her troubleshoot it over FaceTime. So I feel pretty confident that the tips that I'm going to give you are going to help you. After you've got the recipe that you want to use, make sure that you sift your almond flour and icing sugar. What I like to do first is I like to sift my almond flour first to make sure that there are no clumps, remeasure it back out again to make sure that I have the right amount. Then I also sift my icing sugar, and then I incorporate them both together, and then I sift again. I especially do both of these steps if I'm not going to be using a food processor. You can make your meringue however you would like to. I just find Italian meringue is the best way for me, but you can use the Swiss method or you can also use the French method. All you want is you want to make sure that you have nice, stiff, glossy peaks and that it's not over whipped. Right here is where you're probably making the most mistakes. This next part is going to seem a little bit unconventional, and it's probably going to go against the grain of everything else that you've read before. But when I'm adding in the meringue, I add it in all at once. I don't do it in parts and then mix because then I find I get an overmixed batter every single time. I also don't make a paste with the other egg whites that were not in the meringue. So if your recipe calls for this, where you set aside some egg whites and mix it up with the almond flour, I just place the egg whites right in there. Because I've made macarons several times and I know what the batter consistency is supposed to be like, I am being very haphazard with the way that I'm bringing these macaron ingredients together. However, if you're just starting out, I would recommend that you fold in all of the ingredients. Kind of like when you're making a whipped cream and you want to fold in flavorings, or if you're making a meringue and you want to fold in flavorings, do not deflate it until everything is incorporated. You can see here that I noticed that the macaron batter was deflating a little bit too quickly for my liking, so I went back to the folding method to make sure that everything was incorporated. Then I'm going to go back in with the back of my spatula and deflate that meringue. When I was originally taught, I was told to do this with a large balloon whisk, but I just found that I could not control things as well, and it would end up being overmixed. If you've ever had macarons that did end up coming out of the oven with nice feet, but then you notice they had that oily center, this is usually because either they're overmixed or they're underbaked, or you used the food processor too long and you released too many oils from your almond flour. This is why I generally say for beginner bakers to use almond flour that's already fine ground. And now that almond flour is a lot more readily accessible in most places, you're going to more likely be able to find that. But if you can't, you will need to use your food processor. When I was originally taught how to make macarons, the batter was a lot looser than this, and it was even a little bit more translucent, I want to say. But every time I did it that way, I failed every single time. You're also going to hear a lot of people recommend that you use parchment instead of a Silpat. But for me, Silpats are the way to go. And specifically, I really like the Fat Daddy-O's brand, and I also like those pans as well. I invested in really expensive pans from France, and they worked okay, but I just found that because I had to use parchment paper on them, the outside edge macarons were always baked imperfectly. I don't know if that has to do with the type of oven that I'm using or what, but I found that no matter what location, if I used a Silpat with these pans, they always had the best feet and they didn't run into each other. Your macarons can also fail because of the way that you're piping them. If you've ever gotten super slanted macarons before, that could be the way that you're baking them, but it also could be the way that you're piping them. If I'm piping round macarons, or even if I'm doing shaped macarons, I generally like to use a number 5 tip. You're going to find that if you already know how to pipe things like cookies or cakes, you might be piping on a slant. At least that's my inclination. So you really need to be careful that you're piping up and down. And you'll know that you're piping up and down because you can kind of see where you end off on your macaron. And when you look to the side of your macaron, just when it's freshly piped, if it looks like a little bit of a dome, that means that you're you're generally piping straight up and down. But if you see that it's kind of slanted, you know that you need to adjust. You also want to make sure that you're not distributing too much batter because, of course, as we know, macaron batter is going to move, especially when you bang out the pans. And if you distribute too much batter, then that's when you're going to get your macarons running into each other. Banging out your pans is a super underrated and super important step. You really, really need to bang it to get rid of any of those little indentations and air bubbles. And you also want to make sure that you're rotating your pans properly, or else you're going to end up with oblong macarons. With my chocolate shells here, I definitely could have been a little bit more perfect. They're a little bit too peaked on top for my liking. It probably needed maybe 1 or 2 more batter turns and a little bit more slamming of those pans. But the super pale purple macarons that I make later on in this video are a lot more perfect, and you'll generally notice that your batter will start a little bit thicker and then it'll thin out as time goes on. So sometimes the ones that you pipe later on are slightly more perfect. You want to make sure that your macarons rest. I know that there are some no-rest recipes, and they have worked for me in past, but when you are starting out, you want to do everything in your power to make sure that things are going to work in your favor. I like to leave mine resting for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then I preheat my oven to 300 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, here's the trick. You want to make sure that you stick those in as soon as it is preheated. Do not wait and have your oven preheating for so many minutes after that, because things get too browned and those pale colors will no longer be pale. Instead, they'll have a tinge of brown. I bake them for a total of 16 minutes. I do 8 minutes one way, and then I open that oven, turn the pan around, and then 8 minutes again, no more and no less, but you might have to adjust slightly. Then I do not move those macarons off the tray until the tray is fully cooled to the touch. The macaron doesn't necessarily have to be cooled, but it generally will be once the pan is cooled. My rule of thumb is that your macaron shells should come off easily. If they don't and you're finding you're having to scrape your silpat, then you've done something wrong. They're a little bit underbaked then. You want to make sure that they're fully baked through and through, and they should come off those silpats super cleanly. Once you're done that, the hard part is over, and I'm sure if you're the type to attempt to make macarons, then you know how to make simple things like compotes and ganache with relatively no issue. I'm sure you've heard a lot of things about what type of egg whites you should be using and how long you should age them for and how long they need to stay out to come to room temperature. But if you're using the Italian meringue method, I find that you can pretty much do anything as long as you're combining the meringue and the dry ingredients correctly. I'm sure if you've studied up a lot about macarons, then you've probably seen something about letting your macarons mature after you have baked and filled them. I'm not going to say that this is a myth, but I am going to say that this is very much a preference. I don't notice much of a difference. In fact, my family really likes them fresh as opposed to after they've matured in the fridge. Thanks so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so you can be part of the Sweetie fam. Right now, I'm uploading weekly, so make sure you hit that notification bell so you know when I upload. Also, be sure to comment, request, or ask a question. I love hearing from you guys, and definitely let me know if any of these tips have helped you fix your macaron problems. Bye!